Welcome back to the JavaScript Essential Training Series. I am Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we'll be talking about the while loop in JavaScript. So we're still looking at loops in JavaScript, but in this tutorial we'll be discussing the while loop in JavaScript. If you're not certain how many times a loop needs to execute, you can use a while loop to perform your functions. In a while loop, the condition can be something other than a counter. If you remember from the for loop, our condition was a counter for all of our examples. Just like the for loop, the while loop will execute the code while in the curly braces until the condition evaluates to false. So in other words, very similar to the way we set up the for loop, the while loop is going to have those parentheses. We're going to evaluate that condition, and again, until that condition evaluates false, it's going to execute all the code that's in the curly braces. As we saw in our previous example, loops can be very helpful when dealing with arrays, especially if you want to run the same group of code for each item in an array. And we'll actually use another array in the example with our while loops. An important key to remember when dealing with loops: when your browser comes across JavaScript, the rendering engine will stop doing everything else until it processes the JavaScript code. And that's a very important concept as you write JavaScript. So keep in mind, when you're working with loops, because they can get into what's called an infinite loop, you want to make certain that whatever your condition is inside the parentheses, that eventually it will become false, or else you'll never get out of that loop. So it's very important not to get hung up in endless loops, sometimes referred to as infinite loops. That can really drive your browser goofy, and it will. So when designing your code, watch those counters and make certain that eventually your condition will evaluate to false inside the counter. So the standard syntax for a while loop, you'll notice we have our keyword while, just like we had the keyword for. Now this time we're using a keyword while. Our condition now is a very simple condition. In this particular example, it's I is less than 15. And then we actually have the code to execute during the loop. But you'll notice that in the code, the second line actually iterates that I variable, that counter. So to make certain again that we don't get into this infinite loop structure where we cannot get out of our loop. Again, we have our opening curly braces and our closing curly braces. That's what encases or encloses our code that's going to be executed while we're actually in the loop function itself. So let's move into our development environment and demonstrate what we talked about in the presentation. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation and get into our development environment. I'm going to confirm that my Apache server is up and running. I'm going to load Sublime Text 3 with my template.html file loaded, and bring up Google Chrome, which will be my browser for this demonstration. Again, still in section 2 of the tutorial series. Probably going to go a few more tutorials before we actually start section 3 of the series. But we are still in section 2 if you have access to those files. So in this tutorial, we're actually going to be talking about the while loop in JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as while_1.html. I'm going to go ahead and save that file. And then I'm going to go into my browser and load that file. Shouldn't be anything there, and there's not. I'm just going to go ahead and change our title to while loop. And I'm going to go ahead and give us an H3 as we've been doing in most of our tutorials. So we have it a heading on our page. Go ahead and save those changes, refresh my browser window, and we've got while loops in the browser, so we're in the correct file. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples of while loops inside of JavaScript. First thing I want you to understand is we're setting it up a little bit differently, as you saw in the presentation, than we had in the for loop. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my script tags. I'm going to go ahead and come down a few lines and close that script tag. And inside the script tag, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in a variable. And I'm going to call this variable, let me go ahead and indent this. I'm going to call this variable count. And that is going to be equal to 0. And we're actually going to use that as our counter variable inside our while loop. Now we don't have to have a counter variable. I'm going to use it for this demonstration just because of the way I'm writing the demonstration. I'm also going to have a document.write statement before we actually go into the loop, and I'm just going to say starting the loop. That just lets you know that we're in normal flow now, of normal application flow. And once we pass that line of starting loop, we're actually walking into the while loop for our demonstration. So we start it with the keyword while. Then I have my opening and closing parentheses. And again, I'm putting in a little bit of additional space so it's easier for you to see. I'm just going to say if count is less than 10. And remember, we gave count a value of 0. where we declared it up at the top. Then I'm going to go ahead and open and close my curly braces, and inside there I'm going to do a couple of different things. Let me go ahead and copy this so you don't have to watch me type it because it's a pretty long line. So I'm going to come into the while loop and I'm going to say document.write, and in parentheses current count, then I'm going to have a colon with a space. I'm going to use my concatenation symbol. Then I'm going to get the value from the count variable, bring that to the screen, and then give myself a line break or BR tag. Don't need that / closing element anymore, not in HTML5. I like it. Go ahead and save all those changes. And then what I want to do again, so we don't get hung up in this loop, we've got to iterate that count. And I'm going to do that basically the same way we did it in the last exercise. I'm just going to come right below that line of code and I'm going to say count plus plus. So you'll notice now we're actually doing the counter iteration inside the actual code itself and not up in the conditional statement of the while loop. So we're actually doing the increment in the code itself. And then I'm going to come right outside the curly brace, outside my loop. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this document.write. I'm going to come right down below that and say this is where the loop actually stops. So I'm just going to change my text to loop stopped. So what we've done here, let me go ahead and save all these changes. You'll notice we've set up a variable of count and we've given it a value of 0. Then I'm basically just putting in a document.write statement inside of JavaScript letting you know this is where the loop is starting. Then I go into my while loop and I say if count is less than 10. And if count is less than 10, it executes the code that's inside the curly braces. If this evaluates to false, it automatically drops right out of the loop, and I'll show you that in a second. So we go into document.write, current count is, and it's going to give me the count of that variable. Then I'm going to increment the variable and I'm going to go right back into the while loop until this evaluates to false. It keeps executing the code inside the curly braces until the condition evaluates false. So let's go ahead and save all those changes. This is a great time to pause if you want to type that in. I'm going to go into my browser. Let's go ahead and refresh the browser and you'll see now that we've got starting the loop and my current count is 0. And then I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way till we get to 9, and then the count stops. And again, the reason being is because I have less than. If I said less than or equal to, save that change. I also want to put a line break here. I noticed that when we looked at it on the browser window, I've got 2 lines together. Now when I refresh it, it's going to count all the way from 0 to 10. So 0 all the way up to 10. And again, the reason being is because we changed the operator inside the condition. So now I'm saying less than or equal to. The key to understanding a while loop is the fact that it executes all the code between the curly braces as long as the condition is false. If I were to change this and make this 100 and save that change, you'll notice all we're going to see in our browser window is we're going to get a starting and a stopping of the loop. And the reason being is because there's nothing to execute. That never evaluates true. So our loop itself, the count variable is never less than or equal to 10 because we made it 100. If I just make it 11, same thing. It's never less than or equal to 10, so the loop itself is never going to execute. If I were to make this -6, save the change, refresh the browser window, now you'll notice it starts from -6 and goes all the way to 10. And again, we're using that counter to keep track of where we are in the loop. Every time it goes through the loop, it iterates it one time and keeps processing that code until our condition, our count is less than or equal to, until that evaluates false. This code continues to execute. All right, so let's look at one that's a little more complex. I'm going to do save as. The big thing to remember here is while we're going through these while loops, they're a lot less complex. If you look at the actual code itself, they're a lot less complex than the for loop was because we only have one condition we're actually dealing with inside the conditional statement itself, inside our parentheses. Let's go ahead and reload this. Let's bring up while2.html. Let's go ahead and pull out all this code because we're going to start from scratch. This loop's going to be a little bit more complicated. Outside of my script, I'm going to actually go ahead and add a button. Actually, you know what? I'm going to add a button and a paragraph. So I'm going to come right below my H3, and I'm going to put in there, I'm going to put in there a button that's going to actually have an on-click function of while function, and it's going to execute a function when we call it. I've also got a paragraph tag with an ID of reply. And you've seen this in an earlier tutorial. I actually did this, something similar to this in one of our earlier tutorials where I actually used a button to trigger the function that was actually going to run one of our complex conditions, I believe it was, in that tutorial. Now I'm going to go actually in to my script, and I'm going to put in a different type of while loop. So now I've got a function, and the function I've got it named while function. Could be named anything you want it to be named, by the way. Inside my function, I've got a variable called text, which I've given it a value of nothing. It actually is just an empty text field. Then I've got a variable called I, and I've given it a value of 0. And then I said, while I is less than 10, I'm actually going to print a number to my screen inside my paragraph tag. So you notice I've got a break, a paragraph, and then I'm actually going to print this information to reply inside my paragraph tag. I'm using the element get element by ID, so I'm actually building onto this variable. Plus equals means I'm actually setting it up, and every time we go through it, I'm adding to it. So every time we go through this, I'm adding a new line with a new number, and you'll see what I mean when we actually execute this in a minute. But again, running the while loop, and again, I'm using my I as my counter, and this time I'm printing a line into a paragraph with an ID of reply. Let's go ahead and save all these changes. Good time to pause if you want to type them in. I'm going to go back and make sure that I've got while2 loaded in my browser window. When I click the execute loop, you'll notice now I get a number 0, and it goes all the way up to 9. And again, we're just printing this out with the value of the I variable because we're walking through the loop, and as we walk through the loop, I'm printing out the value of I, what the number is in front of it. And then I'm just setting this all up and putting the values of this variable, because what I'm doing is I'm building the entire variable first, then I'm going in and putting all the values of the variable inside my reply. That includes the breaks, the text, and the number. And that's why you see it come up inside this paragraph tag as individual lines inside my paragraph. Not a lot to it. We could actually add this. We could make this anything we wanted, by the way. I could make this 15. I could make it 20. Again, just as we'd done in the previous exercise, the counter is what's actually controlling how long this executes. So again, same type of statement, same type of while loop. We've just executed it a little bit differently. And it's very common to see these types of loops inside of functions. That's why I keep demonstrating these inside of a function and triggering the function with an on-click event. We see that a lot inside JavaScript. We see that a lot in our web development. You'll end up doing that a lot as you develop your own web applications. Concatenating onto variables is quite common in programming. I'm not certain if I'd actually done it in any previous tutorials, and that's what I'm doing right here. I'm actually taking the variable and concatenating it. So I'm saying it's appending it. I'm actually starting out with the very first one. Then with the second one, I'm actually going to the next line, putting in the second, the third. That plus equal is the way that you append variables in quite a few programming languages, actually. It's very similar in C. It's very similar in PHP, JavaScript. I mean, there's a lot of programming languages that use that same plus equal to actually append values onto a variable. So if I hadn't done that before, you'll see a lot of that as we move forward in the tutorials. It is quite common in programming. All right, so let's do another example. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as while_3.html. This time we're going to make it a little bit more complex. We're actually going to use an array as we had done in the for loop. We're going to actually do that in this while loop. I'm going to go ahead and pull out all my code. Let's go ahead and save all those changes to while_3. Let's go load while_3 inside my browser. Shouldn't be anything there yet except the title. And our button, we're going to actually get rid of that button and the paragraph tag. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add a new button to our code right below my H3. And again, I'm just basically using the button so I can trigger the function that's actually going to contain my while loop. Next thing I want to do is I want to create a variable. So I'm going to create a variable inside my script tags. And this variable is going to be called fruits. I think I used fruits in an earlier tutorial, actually. And now I'm actually going to generate a function And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so you don't have to watch me type it all. I'm going to come right down below the fruits. I'm going to get a couple lines so we have some clarity here. Fix out some of my formatting. So now I've created a function called while loop. And in that function, I've created a variable I, which is equal to 0. Then I've created a variable len, L-E-N, that's going to be equal to the fruits.length. So I'm looking at the length of the array, and I'm assigning that to a variable len. And we actually talked about that in the previous tutorial. Then I'm getting into my while loop, and I'm saying while I is less than len. So in other words, while I is less than the length of the array, I want you to print to the browser the fruits in the array are, and then just print out a list of the fruits. And again, we're using the index number to actually move through this array because I is a great numbering. It's a numbering sequence that we're using in the actual while loop itself. It also gives us access to the index numbers in this array: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's why I'm saying fruits I. We're actually addressing those individual elements by their index. And now what I'm doing is I'm incrementing that counter. So the first time it comes through, it's going to be 0. The second time it comes through, it's going to be 1. The third time, it's going to be 2, etc., etc. And then once the function loop stops, or once my while loop stops, I'm still in my function, but I'm saying the while loop has ended. So once we drop out of the while loop, once this no longer evaluates to true, once I get a false, we drop out of the while loop, and it's going to print this last line and let me know that we've completed the while loop. Go ahead and take some of these lines out. Great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. I'm going to go ahead and save all these changes inside my text editor. Let's go into our browser, refresh the browser window. Let's tell it to execute the loop. And you'll notice now I'm getting those the fruits in the array are, and it starts listing them for me. And again, since we're using this dynamically and based on the length of the array, I could easily add additional items, and I'm going to right now. I could easily add additional items to this array. Just going to go ahead and put a comma and paste in some additional items. So now we've added bananas, cherries, got a bunch of spaces in there, which aren't going to hurt anything, by the way. I'm just going to go ahead and take them out for clarity's sake. And again, not going to hurt a thing because we've added to the value of the array. Everything's still going to function just as it had. I added banana, cherry, clementine, and honeydew. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Refresh my browser window, and again, because we have worked this with the length of the array, it just automatically picks up those new entries in the array and prints them to our screen. So again, loops, very, very important aspect of programming. We use them very frequently as we work with arrays inside of JavaScript, also PHP, C, C#. I mean, we use arrays and loops all the time in our programming. You're actually going to see them when we get into our examples, when we actually get into our projects at the end of this series. We'll actually probably be using quite a few loops and quite a few arrays as we work through some of those projects. So the next one we're going to look at is we're going to look at the do while loop inside of JavaScript, and that works very similar to our while loop except for one thing, and it's got a very unique aspect to it. The while loop only functions as long as this counter is less than this condition. In other words, whatever the condition is, it's only going to function in that case. In a do while loop, you're always going to run through the loop at least one time, no matter what the condition is. You'll always run through that loop at least one time. So it brings up some interesting things that we can do with loops in JavaScript, and that's what we're going to look at next in our JavaScript tutorial series.